Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Let me open this lecture by going back to the point that with which I concluded my last lecture, which is about causal over-determination. That is to say, there is no event, no physical event, the explanation of which is not given by reference to a purely physical cause which is insufficient. In other words, there will be ultimately a purely physical and sufficient cause of a given physical change. This point is made in regard to Cartesian dualism, in regard to mental causation within the framework of Cartesian dualism, where the claim is that there are physical changes such as human behavioral changes, like my running a mile, my opening the door of the fridge, or my just speaking, which is uttering sounds. All these are instances of a category of physical change in the physical universe for which there are non-physical causes. I mean, that's what Cartesian dualism talks about. My desire to do such things, my intention to do it, my planning, etc. These are, within Cartesian framework, non-physical events and therefore non-physical mental causes. Now, how is this connected with the so-called disclaimer of genuine causal over-determination? What would be at least a putative example of causal over-determination? Here is an example. Suppose somebody is shot by a revolver and the person's shot is dead as a result of the revolver's shooting at him. Now, there happens to be another person, another shooter, who also shoots at this same person. Then there are two shots made by two different persons at one and the same person who dies, and the death of the person is caused by the very first shot of one of the shooters. That means the very first shot was sufficient, causally sufficient, to make the person die. That means the effect, the physical effect is causally sufficiently explained by the first person's shooting at him. When the second person also shot at him, maybe the second person also had a grudge on him like the first person, the first shooter, then that additional shot, of course, is a shot at the same person who died, but that's an unnecessary cause of the death of the person, because the first thought was sufficient to kill the person. If somebody, for any reason, cites these two shootings by these two shooters as the cause of the death of this other person, then that would be an example of causal overdetermination. Because it's not just, I mean, in this case, it is not just that the death of the person in question is causally determined by a revolver shot. It rather is causally overdetermined, because you are citing two causes when one cause is enough. The second cause is redundant. Okay. So causal overdetermination is a case of causal redundancy. And obviously, there is no genuine case of causal explanation where redundancy is in place. And that's what it means to say that there is no genuine causal overdetermination. How is this relevant to our example of mental causation within the Cartesian framework? We have been saying, along with Descartes, we have been saying that it's my intention to run a mile or to break the window or whatever, which is the cause of that actually breaking the window or actually running a mile, that physical change. So it's the mental cause. And since one cannot ignore the fact that this behavioral change is a physical change, and therefore physical scientific explanation has a necessary place in it, since that fact cannot be ignored, we have to grant that there must be some prior physical cause of this physical change, my limb movement, etc. And that, of course, would be some neurophysiological occurrence, some neural event occurring in my brain. Those neural signals are ultimately connected with this limb movement, this physical change. So we have found, we have necessarily cited a physical cause, neural physical cause for this behavioral physical change. Now, so if P is that physical change, behavioral physical change, my running, my limb movement, then insofar as physical science must be referred to in a causal explanation of this, we have to say that there must be some other physical event, P star, of this physical change, and this P star is a neural event. So we could just put N here, neural event. But then we are also talking about a humanistic causal explanation of this event in the Cartesian framework. We are saying that, well, I as a human being intended to run, therefore intention is the cause. So, but since intention is a mental cause which is non-physical in Cartesian framework, then this intention, let's call it M, is another cause of it, or M is part of the total overall causal factors which ultimately fully explain this physical change P, limb movement. In that case, as I was saying earlier in the last lecture, the total overall causal explanation seems to be P star plus M together is responsible for this behavioral physical change. This is a case of causal overdetermination, because as far as physical science goes, P star by itself is sufficient for explaining P. So if you add M to it, then that would show that P star by itself was not sufficient, and that goes against the principle of causal closure of the physical. It would also mean it's a case of causal overdetermination. And since we have already agreed that there is no genuine causal overdetermination or no genuine redundancy in causal determination, then we have a problem. We have to eliminate one of the causes from this union of P star and M, from this union of a neural cause and a mental cause. Okay? From this, in fact, not union, from this combination, because they are separate. The question now is, which one is going to go? Given the principle of causal closure of the physical and the additional principle that there is no genuine causal overdetermination, if one of these will have to go, which one must be eliminated, must go? And I think it is obvious that M has to go, because P star by itself is causally sufficient. The purely physical event is by itself causally sufficient. M has to go because M appears to be redundant if P star is causally sufficient. M appears to be unnecessary. M appears to be unnecessary not for all reasons, but for this very specific Cartesian metaphysical reason, which is that M is construed as completely non-physical. And that conflicts with the principle of the causal closure of the physical, in which for every physical event there is only and purely and sufficiently a physical cause, nothing non-physical. Okay? So this, of course, it doesn't mean that the problem of mental causation is, I mean, the question of mental causation is answered in a definite way, namely that you simply have to eliminate causes which are purely mental in the sense of being non-mental. I mean, one could say that from this example, what we find is that causal interactionism of Descartes' metaphysics of the mind, that the metaphysical view that the mind is something immaterial, within that framework, there is no such thing as mental causation. Mental causation cannot occur. So-called mental causation is an illusion. I mean, this is how, of course, it would appear from the standpoint of science, given the metaphysics of Cartesian dualism. So, in a way, this is a serious objection against the viability of Cartesian dualism as a metaphysics of the mind. But even if we change the framework from Cartesian dualism, from Cartesian immaterialism to something quite different, and what kind of difference there could be is something that I shall consider subsequently in this lecture. At this point, the point that I am trying to make is that the issue of mental causation is not problematic just within the framework of Cartesian dualism. It is very problematic. It is probably most seriously problematic within the framework of Cartesian dualism. But it could be problematic even within non-Cartesian frameworks. In other words, mental causation is a problem that persists in different metaphysical frameworks about this so-called mind-body relation in theories of mind. At this stage, however, I would like to proceed in a direction which takes us away from that heavy ontological commitment to immaterialism that we have so far discussed with regard to Descartes and the mind-body problem. It's quite clear by now, I hope, that the formidable problems about mind-body relation, especially about mental causation, are owed to that sort of immaterialist, non-physicalist ontology of mind, either as a substance or as an event. So if we have to learn a lesson from these serious problems and thereby explore alternatives to Cartesian dualism, what could be a very reasonable way of finding alternatives? What are indications from these experiences of serious problems? In discussions following Cartesian dualism in the middle of the 20th century, the trend has been towards a kind of anti-immaterialism, which means towards materialism, just the opposite of Cartesian immaterialism. Because the feeling is that Cartesian immaterialism was going against the grain. It was leading to a point which is more like a deadlock, okay? Because there is no possibility of any further explanation, and therefore the only way viable explanation is possible is by changing the framework, by changing the metaphysical framework, by changing the very theoretical perspective. And that is the radical change from the immaterialist perspective to a materialist one. And no wonder the subsequent movement that became the next alternative to Cartesian dualism is a certain kind of monism. And as you know, I hope you know, that monism is the metaphysics of one substance, the ultimate reality of one substance. Cartesian dualism was obviously a metaphysics of two substances, two independent substances, the physical body and the non-physical mind. And because of this radical ontological distinction, this heterogeneity, ontological heterogeneity, the causal interaction between these two substances appeared to be fraught with insurmountable problems. Therefore, the desire for monism would naturally strike anyone as the most reasonable move to make, or the most reasonable lesson to learn from these otherwise dismal results. So what kind of monism? I mean, monism, of course, is about one substance. Now, merely from the concept of monism, it's not obvious what that substance is like, ontologically speaking, that one substance as ultimate reality. Well, I mean, if we have to learn from Cartesian dualism, the two-substance ontology, we can, of course, figure out that that one substance could be an immaterial substance. Let's say reality ultimately is completely immaterial in nature. It could be of the nature of spirit or something completely non-physical in its essence. That would be monism. And there is a theory called panpsychism, where panpsychism means that everything is mental, where mental is meant in a Cartesian sense as non-physical or non-material, okay, or spiritual in nature. But monism could also be the other half of Cartesian dualism, that is physicalist monism, materialist monism, that ultimate reality is completely, entirely physical, material. Okay. The question now is, which kind of monism has been the most reasonable alternative after learning dismal lessons from the problems of Cartesian dualism? Obviously, it is not immaterialist monism, it is materialist or physicalist monism. In short, it is physicalism as it is known. Physicalism is the term that signifies the monism that is in question. So the monism that is in question is physicalist monism, or in short, physicalism, as I just said. And with regard to the mind-body problem, what this physicalist monism signifies is this, that the mental is not something non-physical. Obviously, it cannot be non-physical because there is no reality which is other than physical. And therefore, the mental is in some sense physical. So it's a reductive move that theory makes. That is to say, if the mental is conceived in non-physical terms, and it is conceived in non-physical terms if we refer to common sense. Our commonsensical understanding of the mental certainly is quite significantly incompatible with what we take the physical to be, because the properties that are standardly assigned to the physical, even in our common sense conception of the physical, are not associated with the mental, even in the commonsensical sense. For example, if I'm thinking about something, the thought is occurring as a mental event, as a mental process, and we talk about this thought as being an intelligent thought or a stupid thought. Now, these attributions of intelligence or stupid or serious thought or superficial thought, these attributions, these characterizations are never characterization of physical properties or physical events. Or we don't say this thought is a very heavy thought that weighs 10 kilogram. We of course talk about heavy thoughts, but heaviness of a thought is only a metaphorical heaviness, not literal heaviness. So we don't ascribe weight to mental states in the literal sense of weight. We don't ascribe shape and size to mental states in the literal sense of shape and size. And these are physical properties. There are such examples which tell us that our common sense conception of the mind is rather non-physical in nature. Okay. Now, if physicalism is the basic ontology of reality, and if mental states that occur to us are real, are part of this reality, then it is obvious that they, in some sense, will have to be physical or reducible to the physical, precisely because commonsensically we think otherwise. We think about mental states to be otherwise in non-physical terms. So by reference to common sense, the physicalist monist position will undertake a reductive program, the program of reducing the so-called non-physicalist conceptualization of mental states to purely physical conceptualizations. That means mental states would be reduced to physical states. This reductive theoretical strategy, physicalist strategy, is precisely the most dominant move that was made in the middle of the 20th century when discussions of very highly problematic Cartesian dualism regarding mental causation had gained tremendous ascendancy. And in reducing so-called non-physical mental states to purely physical states, that reductive strategy took the form of identity. And what is meant by identity is this. Suppose you're talking about a particular mental state. Take the favorite example of a pain state that occurs to you. This pain mental state, this inner mental state, commonsensically is thought to be quite non-physical in nature, because the innerness of a mental state is a standard paradigmatic way of understanding the non-physical nature of a mental state, because physical states don't have this kind of innerness. And here innerness doesn't mean having an inside, like the inside of a box or inside of a brain, but inner in a very private sense, very, very subjective, mental inner. So if pain state as an inner state in this special subjective sense of inner is had by me, commonsensically I would think that something non-physical is occurring. Now, of course, it may not be too obvious for common sense, but maybe not too unobvious either to common sense, that whenever this pain state or any such inner state occurs in me as a person, human person, something goes on in the brain, in my brain. Okay. By now, common sense has acquired that much of, let's say, that much of idea that our mentality has something to do with our brain, something crucial. In a crucial way, there is a relation between our mind and our brain. And when that point is made more theoretically explicit, in a more cognitively sophisticated sense, then we would say that every mental state, every mental occurrence has some sort of a neural correlate, some sort of correlate in the brain. Some brain event is a neural correlate of every mental state or mental occurrence. So the first step in this theoretical understanding would be that there is a correlation between the mental and the neural, correlation between events in the mind and events in the brain. It's a very, very intimate relation. Nonetheless, it's a relation of, it's a correlation. The question now is whether we are still talking about two things. One is the mental event of, let's say, my pain occurring at a particular time, and the neural event that is also occurring at that very time in my brain. In the discussion in the middle of the 20th century, the favorite expression was that this pain mental state is correlated with some sort of C fiber firing or neuron firing. Okay. Apparently, it looks as though we are referring to two distinct events, mental event and neural event, even if they are occurring simultaneously. The temporal, that simultaneity doesn't mean they are one and the same. They are still two. In other words, some kind of dualism would persist. And of course, physicalist monism will not tolerate this kind of dualism. The whole point of physicalist monism is that it's monism completely, no dualism. That means if the mental is physical, then that is the ease of identity. Okay? Which means if a pain mental state is occurring at T1 in me, then even if we talk about this pain mental state having a neural correlate in the brain, which is a very definite neural state, a very definite neuron firing state. This correlation is actually an identity. Okay. This correlation is an identity, and this point about correlation becoming identity is important because in some other cases, a correlate need not be a case of identity. But here it is claimed to be a case of identity. So my pain mental state is nothing other than this C fiber firing in my brain, the firing of a particular kind of neural pattern, neuron firing pattern. It's identical. Ontologically, it's one and the same. That means the commonsensical conception of inner mental states being irreducibly mental or non-physical, that conception has been shown to be, or at least argued to be, completely mistaken. In other words, the commonsensical conception would be perceived as some kind of a Cartesian residual conception. There is residual Cartesianism in it. That means the Cartesian dualistic metaphysical conception somehow is implicit in our common sense. It's only implicit because common sense is not a theoretical realization. For Descartes, it was a theoretical claim that the mental is non-physical. But if common sense also has a similar inclination, it's not, this inclination, non-physicalist inclination, is not a theoretical one. It's just implicit because of the way mental states strike us in their nature. Okay, now what I'm saying is that when the mental is identical with the neural or the physical, then the name of the theory that these thinkers gave is identity theory, or identity physicalism, or physicalist identity theory. That became the next best theoretical candidate in this perennial mind-body problem after Descartes. And of course, all this happened only in the middle of the 20th century. What would be a more detailed understanding of this identity theory about mental states, and how does it fare in the so-called problematic of mental causation? It is on these 2 points, 2 interrelated points, that I would like to say something at this moment. Now, is there a proof that a mental state is nothing else but a purely physical state? I mean, is this reductive theory, identity theory, supported by any kind of proof? Or is it just a conceptual argument that's being put forward? Or is it some kind of a priori claim of identity? Now, an example of an a priori identity claim would be those linguistic examples like a bachelor is identical with an unmarried male, or an unmarried woman is identical with a spinster, etc. Or 1 plus 1 is identical with 2, or 2 is identical with 1 plus 1, like that. Now, these are a priori identity claims because these identity claims are not empirical. They are not based on experience. They are not based on factual data. They are based on the mere meanings of those terms. The term bachelor means unmarried male. So these two terms, unmarried male on the one hand and bachelor on the other hand, they are synonymous. So synonymy claims, these linguistic synonymy claims, are claims of a priori identity. Is this identity theory of mind, reductive theory, is this also a case of this kind of a priori identity? Now, if it were a case of a priori identity, then of course it would be surprising. I mean, how could you say that the pain as a mental state that I experience is nothing other than just a state in my brain, not by doing any empirical examination, but simply by making the claim that the word pain is synonymous with the word, say, neural event this. That would be an absurd claim. Okay? I mean, these are not, if they are identical at all, they can't be identity of meaning in the sense of synonymy, like bachelor and unmarried male. So it must be another kind of identity, not a priori identity. What is this other kind of identity? Non-a priori kind of identity? Of course, the straightforward answer to that would be that it's identity of the a posteriori kind. It's a posteriori identity. And a posteriori, of course, means that it's something that is based on empirical evidence, based on factual investigation or information. It's posterior to investigation, factual or cognitive or other kind of investigation. What would be a good paradigm of this kind of a priori identity? These theorists of identity physicalism proceeded in this very manner by beginning with this distinction between a priori identity and a posteriori, contingent a posteriori identity. They began like that. And so they provided paradigmatic examples of a posteriori identity. And these paradigmatic examples really help in understanding this proposed theory called identity theory or physicalism about mind-body relation. And they drew these paradigmatic examples from the field of natural science. One very, very common example is the identity between water and H2o. Everybody accepts that water is H2o. Water is identical with H2o. It's an identity statement that occurs in the science of chemistry. Now, it's a scientific identity claim of chemical science. Since it is a scientific claim, it is obvious that the basis of this claim is some kind of empirical investigation, because that's what makes science science. Through empirical investigation, it reports its results, and the claim becomes a scientifically acceptable claim when there is a demonstration of the truth of the claim. Now, in this case of water which is being claimed to be identical with 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen, this claim had to be established by chemistry, by the scientific investigation of chemistry. Because 100 years ago, 100 years ago from today, there was no such information, no such statement that water is H2O, because chemical science had not developed that much. Okay. I mean, at that time, water was a substance and science didn't quite know. I mean, modern chemistry is a recent phenomenon. So older science didn't quite know what is the real essence of water. But they were in search of the real essence of water. And they succeeded in finding out the real essence, which is H2O. And then they were in a position to say, to make this claim that water is identical with H2O. So that identity sign is a result of years of empirical investigation. So this is a paradigmatic example of how identities are established in science. There are so many other identity claims that have been established. For example, lightning. What was our conception of lightning, let's say 100 years ago? I mean, sometimes it was more mythological. When there was lightning, thunder and lightning, some people at least, some communities believe that the sky god is angry and therefore it's making this kind of noise. Anyway, when science was trying to investigate what exactly is lightning, at that time, I mean before modern science, there was no answer, no precise answer. Later on, what happened? That is, today we know lightning is atmospheric electrical discharge. So today we are able to write this equation as an identity claim. Lightning is equivalent to atmospheric electrical discharge. This identity has been established through scientific investigation. And similarly, there are many other identities established by scientific investigation. If you take this as the paradigm for the mind-brain identity, then it's rather obvious what these identity theorists, these physicalists in the philosophy of mind are thinking of. They are thinking of the possibility of establishing the identity of any given mental state with a definite neurophysiological state or neural state. And that can be established if, for example, neuroscience advances to a certain extent, to a great extent, in fact, and all the required clarification of mental concepts, all the required precision in the conceptualization of mental terms is also achieved. So on the one hand, a mental term would be very precisely and determinately worked out, and then what exactly is the neural correlate of that mental state will be investigated by the neurophysiologist, so that ultimately that neural correlate will be identified with this so-called mental state. So they're hoping, I mean, the identity theory put itself as an empirical theoretical claim that one day this identity will have been established, firmly established. Okay. So it was more like a scientific program. So this is physicalism, this is identity theory, this is monism. And now there are two types of this physicalism, this identity theory. And these two types, in fact, these two kinds of identity theory are known as type identity theory and token identity theory. This type-token distinction is utilized here. We should begin with the type identity theory because that's conceptually prior to, or in fact even temporally prior to the token identity theory. So what type identity theory means is this general claim that for every type, mental type, there is a neurophysiological type. For example, pain is a mental type. Every pain type is identical with a certain type of neural event. Since it is type identity, you can then make law-like statements about these identity claims. Just as, you know, the identity between water and H2o is a strict identity which conforms to a certain nomological characterization. That is to say, it's a law-like connection. Okay? Every case of water is a case of H2o. That's the law-like characterization of the statement. Similarly, every case of pain is a case of a certain kind of neural event. So this is a fairly strong physicalist identity claim. I mean, as strong as the kind of rigorous identity which is advocated in the case of chemistry, the water H2O connection, water H2O identity. Now this sort of strong claim about the identity of a type of mental state with a type of physical state, if it is empirically grounded, if it is supposed to be empirically grounded like other identity claims, there is a problem. The problem is this. I mean, the problem is already anticipated. How is it anticipated? Well, suppose at a particular time pain is occurring in me. So this particular type of mental state is occurring in me. Then, of course, at that particular time, there will be a definite pattern of, definite kind of neural event, brain event. That's true. And that can be detected, let's say, scientifically detected. What kind of pattern is there? Now, 2 hours later, if I'm having the same kind of pain, what guarantee is there that the brain pattern correlative to this second occurrence of the same kind of pain which I had in my first occurrence, what guarantee is there? What guarantee is there that the brain pattern of this second occurrence is identical to the brain pattern of the first occurrence? In other words, what is the guarantee that every time I have, say, a particular type of pain, every time, 5 times, 6 times, 10 times, every time if I have the same type of pain, what guarantee is there that it would be the same brain pattern that would recur without any difference, without even a minute difference? Now, this is an anticipated problem because from the knowledge of brain science, it's already clear that the possibility of recurrence of the same brain pattern corresponding to one type of mental state is very low. I mean, the probability is very low because of the plasticity of the human brain. The human brain is not a kind of system that's very static or rigidly confined, rigidly constituted system. It's a very plastic system. Plasticity of the brain, given that as a fact, makes the possibility of that kind of recurrent identity in the pattern of neural events corresponding to a given type of mental event rather unlikely. In other words, and let me today conclude this lecture with this point. The problem is that type identity theory or type identity physicalism is too strong a physicalist theory to be really viable. I mean, you can be a physicalist, you can be an identity theorist, but probably you have to relax your identity claim, not by giving up the identity claim, but a version of the identity claim has to be sought which would be weaker than the very strong, unreasonably strong identity physicalist claim known as type identity theory. And that alternative, more moderate version of identity physicalism is known as token identity theory. About that, I shall talk in the beginning of my next lecture. Thank you very much.